January the 3rd, 1979, began as one of those winter mornings that seemed harmless at first glance. The cold was still biting, the sky still pale, but for the first time in more than a week, the temperature in Snohomish County, Washington, had crawled just above freezing. After days of being confined indoors, the residents felt a loosening in the air, as if the season itself was finally exhaling. For most people, it meant errands, a quick walk outside, maybe a visit to a neighbor. For one man, it meant something simpler. He wanted to hunt ducks, make a little money, and enjoy the rare break in the weather. The unnamed duck hunter stepped out into the slow thaw of that morning with no intention of becoming part of a story that would outlive him by decades. He only wanted a decent hunt, a few birds, maybe a fish or two. Nothing dramatic, nothing historic. But that quiet optimism lasted only as long as it took for him to reach the shoreline of the Snohomish River Delta, a place where the river met the brackish edges of Puget Sound, where mud, mist, and silence swallowed the landscape. He walked across the mudflats at the westernmost point of North Spencer Island, the kind of place where early morning felt older somehow, more ancient. The slows bent toward each other like two tired arms curling into a single body of water. He positioned himself where hunters had stood 1,000 times before, waiting for the sky to move. But before he could set his plan in motion, something else moved instead, something tangled in a stretch of abandoned fishing line. It was the wrong shape, the wrong color, the wrong everything. Curiosity first, then confusion. And then that unmistakable dread that starts in the chest and slides downward in a heavy, icy drop. What began as a promising winter morning had just become the day a man stumbled upon human remains. He walked closer. Carefully. Almost unwillingly. And there, knotted in the fishing net, was a pair of khaki pants. Not empty. Not simply debris. Still holding impossibly what was left of a human leg, a shoe, a bone, a glimpse of something that had once belonged to someone. The hunter stepped back, breathing shallowly. No one expects to find death tucked between mud and shoreline. No one goes looking for it in a place meant for ducks and quiet. But death had been waiting there anyway. Law enforcement reached the spot shortly after he made the call. The cold air around the water carried a stillness that didn't feel natural anymore. Deputies scanned the shoreline carefully, and within minutes, it was clear the remains were not limited to the first find. About 5 feet from a fallen cedar log, stretching nearly 12 feet across the mud, they found a red-orange, white, and gray checkered shirt. Not folded, not discarded. Just lying there with the eerie stillness of something separated violently from its owner's life. Beside it were ribs, another shoe, this one still containing a foot and a skull. What remained of a human being was scattered almost as though the tide, time, and nature had worked together to dismantle whatever story had come before. The officers moved quietly, not because they needed to, but because something about the scene demanded a certain reverence. The mudflats weren't just mudflats anymore. They were a graveyard no one had meant to create. As they continued searching, officers found a leather wallet, empty and worn from water. Whatever had once been inside money, identification, scraps of paper had dissolved into the brackish wash long ago. All that remained of it was the shell. Nearby, they located a belt within the waist range of 33 to 34 inches, a piece of SOG gear, and a pair of lace-up shoes size 8 or 8.5, with the name O'Sullivan printed on the heel. The khaki pants bore a tag reading, "Never needs ironing," made in the United States, an almost mocking sort of normal detail, in a place that had become anything but normal. Nothing about the scene suggested a clear story. No signs of a struggle, no obvious weapon, no apparent cause of death. But the man whose bones lay twisted along the shoreline had once lived, worn these clothes, walked in these shoes, carried this wallet. Someone had known him, someone had spoken his name, someone had heard his laugh, or at least his voice. But in January 1979, no one in Snohomish County could say who he was. The coroner at the time, Robert Phillips, examined what little could still be examined. The remains were largely skeletal. The cold, the water, and the erosion had stripped away almost everything that could have told an easy story. All the coroner could say for certain was that the remains belonged to a man and that he had been dead for months. Months. Not days, not weeks, months. But not years, not yet. Without a name, without dental records that survived, without clothing that offered more than vague clues, the man became John Doe, specifically John Doe 1979-1, and the cause of death was listed as undetermined. The county held on to the remains for roughly 10 weeks, before burying him in a pauper's grave at Cypress Memorial Park on March 15, 1979. Back then, unidentified remains were often interred rather than stored indefinitely. Today they remain under the medical examiner's care, but those rules had not yet come to be. The investigation, such as it was, stalled quickly. Without a name, without a missing persons report that matched, without a face to place in the newspaper, the John Doe case drifted into the shadows. There were dozens of missing men across the region during that period, and none aligned neatly enough with the partial remains found on Spencer Island. And so, the case went cold. But time is rarely truly silent, and justice, even when it falters, has an odd way of circling back. 3 decades passed. Whole generations were born, grew up, and grew old. Technology evolved beyond what detectives in 1979 could have imagined. And somewhere deep inside a forgotten file cabinet, a case labeled John Doe 1979-1 continued waiting for eyes willing to see what others had missed. In 2008, Snohomish County Detective Jim Scharf, together with retired Judge Ken Cossert, reopened a mountain of dusty cold cases. Among them was the long-buried mystery of the man found near the Snohomish River Delta. The more they studied the faded documents, the more frustrated they became. The file was thin, almost skeletal itself. Notes, incomplete. Leads, undocumented. It was unclear whether investigators in 1979 ever cross-referenced missing persons reports properly, or whether any potential matches were ruled out. The detectives faced an unpleasant truth. Decades of pre-digital record-keeping had erased more than time ever could. Still, Scharf and Cossert refused to abandon the case. In 2015, nearly 36 years after the remains were first discovered, investigators sought permission to exhume John Doe's body. The request was approved, and the bones were removed from the earth and transferred to the medical examiner's office. There, forensic odontologist Dr. Kyle Tanaka attempted to chart whatever remained of the man's dental structures. It was a long shot. The teeth had degraded, the skull had suffered environmental damage, and the small hope that a dental match might surface faded quickly. The charts were uploaded to national missing persons databases. Nothing. The case was added to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System (NamUs) in August 2015. Still nothing. Detectives re-examined the belongings once found on the shoreline. The shoes, the belt, the wallet, the pants. They suspected the clothing might have been second-hand. If true, it meant any traceable purchase history would be useless. By late 2015, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office publicly pleaded for residents to come forward with even the faintest scrap of information. They received one lead, a promising one. A missing farmhand from Marysville, last seen in the late 1970s, was said to have had a noticeable limp, a drinking problem, and a reason to frequent the region. Detectives chased this tip for a month. They believed they were close. Then came the blow. The man had a tombstone in Yuma, Arizona. He had died in 1981. Yet again, John Doe 1979-1 slipped back into the dark. But things were about to change. When the medical examiner's office re-examined the exhumed remains, new details emerged, details that had not been recorded decades earlier. The man's femur, the left one, had been shattered long before he died. Not cracked, not fractured, shattered. And it had healed horribly. The bone was misshapen, jagged in places, almost warped. A healed break like that would have forced him to walk with a severe limp and significant pain. It would have shortened the leg by roughly 2 inches. Dr. Kathy Taylor, Washington State forensic anthropologist, studied the bones in April 2016. She estimated the man's age to be somewhere between 27 and 61. A wide range, yes, but consistent with heavy erosion. His ancestry, she believed, could be Native American, Caucasian, or mixed. His height was estimated between 5'1" and 5'7". Not exactly distinctive numbers, but enough to reshape the search. Then the dental discoveries came. The man had been missing 2 upper front teeth and 2 molars long before his death. The sockets were healed. He also had alloy fillings, the kind that required dental care, likely in childhood or adolescence. So he had received medical care at some point. And yet, he never sought treatment for a shattered leg that would have been impossible to ignore. Detectives began theorizing. Had he been homeless? Had he been working in conditions where injuries were ignored? Had he been in prison at some point? Had he been a fisherman living on boats where medical access was limited? None of the theories fully made sense. And then, in April 2016, forensic artist Natalie Murray created a facial reconstruction. She studied the smoothness of the bone, the nasal aperture, the mandibular shape. She assembled the face as carefully as she could, knowing full well that time distorts, that water corrodes, that bones soften. Still, she produced a face human again, and detectives released it to the public. Nothing happened. But the story wasn't over. In 2018, a sample of the man's femur was sent to the University of North Texas for DNA extraction to upload into CODIS, the FBI's national database. In March 2019, enriched DNA produced mitochondrial and STR profiles. A retired police officer recognized the sketch, said he had seen a man with a limp like that in the 1970s, but he couldn't recall a name. Another dead end. It would take nearly 4 more years and a breakthrough in forensic genealogy before the story of John Doe 1979-1 finally began to unravel. And when it did, it revealed a life far more tragic, fragmented, and mysterious than anyone could have predicted. This is Disturbed Intent. If you're still with us, take a moment to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories into the light. The years after 2019 brought something the investigators hadn't felt in a long time. Movement. Slow at first, almost imperceptible, but real, the kind of forward motion that feels like a faint current beneath a long frozen river. Because despite all the scientific advances, despite the reconstruction, despite the public appeals, despite the DNA profiles uploaded into national systems, they still did not have a name. They only had a man whose bones told fragments of a story, but no one who could speak to the full truth of his life. Detectives Scharf and Cossard had learned one thing from decades of cold cases. Sometimes, the case breaks only when the world is finally ready for it. And in the early 2020s, the world had stepped into a new age of forensic science, one powered by genealogical DNA, by private laboratories, by advanced sequencing techniques that could pull entire histories out of degraded bones thought to be useless. So in the year 2021, investigators sent another piece of the man's femur to Othram Labs, a private forensic genealogy company in Texas known for solving cases no one else could touch. This time, they weren't looking for a simple DNA match. They were searching for family, for ancestors, for the constellation of genetic clues that could rebuild the life of a man long erased by water, time, and neglect. The testing was funded by DNAsolves.com, a group committed to helping families find answers. No matter how many years had passed, they believed no one should remain unknown forever. Their funding, their advocacy, and their partnerships had already solved numerous cold cases around the country. Now, Spencer Island John Doe was getting his turn. When the femur sample arrived at Othram, scientists began the painstaking process of extracting forensic-grade DNA from bone that had been underwater, underground, exhumed, and stored for decades. Normally, that kind of degradation destroys everything. But the femur, despite its hellish injury, held on to one last secret. Months later, Othram succeeded. They produced a complete DNA profile rich enough to be uploaded to public genealogy databases, powerful enough to identify biological relatives, and when investigators uploaded the profile to Family Tree DNA, the first glimmers of truth appeared. A small match, not a sibling, not a parent, not a close relative, but still a connection. One that could be followed like a thread that wound through Kansas, through military families, through remarriages, through a boy whose name had once been known. The medical examiner's office, alongside Detective Jim Scharf and death investigator Adam Wilcoxon, worked on the genealogy in long sessions, pulling clues from every corner of the emerging family tree. Hours of building, refining, confirming. And then, in a quiet moment, after nearly 3 hours of intense reconstruction, a name formed in front of them. Gary Lee Haney. They circled it. They cross-checked it. Then they reached out to his closest surviving relatives, including a half-sister. She agreed to submit her DNA. When the results returned, the match was undeniable. It was him. After 44 years of silence, the man once called Spencer Island John Doe, once buried in a pauper's grave without ceremony, once anonymous and unreachable, finally had a name. The announcement came on February 10, 2023. His name was Gary Lee Haney. But identifying him didn't end the mystery. It opened it wider. And what waited inside that new doorway was a life full of fractures, gaps, disappearances, and questions that investigators realized might never be answered. Gary had been born on September 23, 1950, in Topeka, Kansas. His biological mother was Bernice Helen Schaefer, only 28 at the time. His father was 37-year-old Joseph Dominique Contamiti. But within months of his birth, the marriage collapsed, his parents divorced, and the trajectory of Gary's life shifted forever. By 1955, when Gary was only 5 years old, his mother married a military man named Sheldon Lee Haney. Sheldon adopted the little boy and changed his name from Gary Joseph Contamiti to the name that would follow him into adulthood, Gary Lee Haney. From that point on, Gary's life revolved around the movements of a military household. He traveled, he relocated, he lived in multiple states, he saw parts of the country most children his age never did. His stepfather's career meant frequent transfers, which meant no long-term friends, no consistent community, and no solid roots. His extended family described him as quiet, unusual, gentle, musically inclined. He loved the Beatles. He played the piano. He had an inwardness, a softness, something tender but vulnerable. But he also had something else, something no one could ever fully understand. Family members later told investigators that Gary lived with some kind of mental disorder. Some believed it may have been schizophrenia. Others suggested he might have been on the autism spectrum. In the 1950s and 1960s, diagnoses were often imprecise, misunderstood, or ignored entirely. Whatever Gary struggled with, his family noticed signs. His step-cousin, Hal Haney, said later, "There was something amiss in his brain that caused people to notice." But Gary wasn't dangerous. He wasn't violent. He wasn't criminal. He was simply different and different. In those decades, often meant isolated. His family moved often enough that extended relatives barely saw him. Holidays came and went, and the Haneys rarely visited. The family lived too far, they said. Too busy, too transient. Gary became a ghost long before he ever disappeared. By the age of 16, tragedy struck. His biological father, whom he barely knew, died in a Missouri Veterans Hospital. 3 years later, his mother Bernice also died. Gary was 19 years old and parentless. Sheldon, his adoptive father, continued raising him, but something shifted. Records show that by the mid-1970s, Gary was living in some form of boarding house or rooming situation. Social Security documents revealed that he collected some type of benefits, but investigators could never determine who managed those funds or how the arrangements were made. Then came the strangest twist of all. According to Social Security records, Gary was declared legally dead on Christmas Eve of 1976. Nearly 3 years later, on January 3, 1979, his remains were found tangled in nets near Spencer Island. How could he have been declared dead before he died? Who reported him deceased? Where was he living? Where had he been buried? Why had no one challenged the death report? Why had no missing person report ever been filed? Why did no one look for him? Even after decades of cold case experience, detectives were stunned. When investigators contacted Gary's step-cousin, Hal Haney, he was shocked to learn the truth. He had last seen Gary as a boy. The Haney family had moved so frequently that extended relatives rarely interacted, and by Gary's adulthood, he had completely slipped out of the family's collective awareness. Hal said something quietly heartbreaking. "He just disappeared from our family, and no one really knew what happened to him." Hal had been compiling family history for years on ancestry websites. He had photographs, lineage, names, and dates for dozens of relatives. But he had almost nothing for Gary, not a single adult photo, not a picture of him beyond childhood, not a trace of what he looked like as a grown man. Even after identifying the remains, Hal said, We still don't even know what Gary looked like after he grew up. The emotional weight of that statement lingered in the air for investigators. How does someone's entire adulthood vanish? How does a man walk through years of life with no documented footprint, no family contact, no paper trail, no anchor to anyone or anything? How does a person die, unidentified, while living less than 20 minutes from where his adoptive father resided and no one notices? Detectives searched for records showing that Sheldon, Gary's adoptive father, had filed a missing person report. None existed. Sheldon lived in Everett, the same region where Gary's remains were found. He was alive during the 1980s. He traveled to Baja California in the winters. He visited extended family. He lived until 1997. But Sheldon never once mentioned Gary. Not to relatives, not to investigators, not to anyone. Detectives found this deeply unsettling. Why would a father, adoptive or not, never report his son missing? Why would he remain silent for decades? And how had Gary ended up dead in the tide flats? As investigators dug deeper into Gary's medical mystery, the most disturbing detail resurfaced: his shattered femur. Dr. Taylor had examined the bone, and what she found was not a simple break. It was catastrophic, the type of injury that would have left Gary in immense, constant pain. She stated that the break had healed in a way she had never seen in her career. It looked like something out of a third-world medical environment, untreated, unaddressed, left to mend however nature forced it to. The healed break had shortened his leg and twisted his gait. Anyone who saw him walk would remember him. Yet none of Gary's extended family remembered such an injury. So when and how did it happen? A workplace accident? A fall from a height? A vehicle collision? A beating? A collapse while alone? An injury sustained on a fishing boat? Something darker? The theories were endless, and every one of them came with holes. For all the forensic details uncovered, the emotional truth of Gary's life remained intangible, like smoke that shifts every time you try to hold it. Even the dental evidence, his missing front teeth, his missing molars, the alloy fillings created more questions than answers. The fillings indicated access to dental care at some point. The missing teeth indicated injury or decay. But how could someone who had dental care never receive treatment for a broken leg that left him permanently deformed? One theory floated by detectives was that Gary may have received dental treatment in childhood, when under parental care, and then lost access as an adult. But the more investigators learned about the timeline, the less certain anything became. In 2016, investigators created a facial reconstruction. But when forensic anthropologist Dr. Taylor examined the reconstruction, she said it appeared half Native American and half Caucasian, which aligned with the DNA analysis. But the reconstruction still couldn't give Gary back his adult identity, because no living relative had seen his adult face. Even when a retired officer later said he remembered a man with a limp like that in the 1970s, he still couldn't supply a name. Gary was the kind of man who passed through the world quietly, softly, faintly, like a shadow in the corner of a photograph. And so investigators turned their attention to the last 3 years of his life. From the moment he was declared legally dead in 1976 to the moment his remains washed into the tide flats in January 1979. Those 3 years were a vacuum, a black hole, a place with no records, no statements, no accounts, no sightings that could be verified. Had Gary lived alone? Had he been homeless? Had he been hospitalized? Had he been living in a boarding house that no longer existed? Had he been living with his adoptive father at some point? Had he been working under the table? Had he been drifting? Had he been further away and only returned near the time of his death? No one knew. The only thing investigators could say with certainty was this: Gary had suffered. His femur told the story of a man who lived in pain for years. His missing teeth whispered of trauma. His empty wallet suggested either poverty, robbery, or simple erosion. His scattered remains hinted at water movement, environmental decay, or the slow pull of tides over time. Detective Scharf said, "We have never seen a fracture that healed like that." Even Jane Jorgensen, an investigator at the medical examiner's office, said the entire case defied logic. Even if he was homeless, he would have still gone to an emergency room. Medical care isn't denied. So why didn't he? Why hadn't anyone helped him? Why had Gary slipped so far into the cracks that when he died, no one even knew he was gone? In the months following his identification, Gary's surviving relatives discussed placing a permanent marker on his grave, something he had never received. His step-cousin Hal said, "I felt a draw to do something about his gravesite." But the family had been scattered across the country for decades. Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Utah, and none lived near Washington. Even with a name reclaimed, Gary remained, in many ways, alone. Identifying him did not restore his life. It only reintroduced the question: how did a boy born in mid-century Kansas, raised in a military family, end up dead in the cold tide flats of Snohomish County, overlooked by everyone, missed by no one, and forgotten for 44 long years? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, did Gary know he was alone? Or had he been waiting for someone who never came? This is Disturbed Intent. Even with Gary Lee Haney's identity finally known, the revelation did not end the mystery. If anything, it deepened it. It took what had once been a simple question, "Who is this man?" and cracked it into dozens more. Questions that pulled investigators backward through time, into forgotten rooms, lost paperwork, abandoned buildings, fractured records, and a life that had quietly fallen apart long before death took him. Detectives began the next phase, not by studying his bones, but by trying to understand the world Gary lived in during his final years, a world shaped by isolation, instability, and the painful consequences of mental illness in a time when society had few ways to help. His surviving family remembered fragments: a music-loving boy who played the piano, a child who moved constantly from base to base, whose life was shaped by the schedules of military housing, a teenager who withdrew more with each year, whose emotional storms were rarely spoken about openly, a young man whose relationship with his adoptive father, Sheldon, seemed tense, distant, or complicated in ways no one had ever fully explained. Relatives recalled that Sheldon was strict, disciplined, a product of military culture and an older generation of parenting that prioritized order over emotion. There was no record that Sheldon harmed Gary or mistreated him, but there were signs of profound disconnect. By the late 1960s, Gary was no longer the child his family had once known. He seemed lost, detached, drifting, and, as his mother passed away in 1969, that sense of drifting only intensified. Investigators learned that after Bernice's death, Sheldon continued raising Gary alone, but no one could say how close they were. No one could say whether they talked about the things that mattered: Gary's health, his mental state, his hopes, or his struggles. As relatives looked back, they said they could not recall a single conversation with Sheldon about Gary in his adult years, not one. It was as if the topic had been wiped from family interactions, avoided quietly and consistently for reasons unknown. And that silence, detectives felt, hinted at something important, something that might explain why no missing person report had ever been filed. As they retraced Gary's final years, they returned again to that bizarre, impossible detail. Social Security records showed Gary had been declared legally dead on Christmas Eve of 1976. Yet his remains were not found until the first week of January 1979. That meant someone, an individual or an institution, had reported him deceased. But who? And why? The investigators contacted Social Security officials in an attempt to trace the origin of that death report. But older files, especially those from the 1970s, often lacked clear documentation. Digital records did not exist. Paper records were lost, destroyed, or archived so deeply that there was no clear path to retrieve them. They encountered dead ends at every turn. Was it possible a clerical error had been made? Yes, but rare. Social Security typically required some form of confirmation for a death report. Was it possible his adoptive father had reported him deceased? That was more likely, but why would he? Especially if Gary had still been alive. Had Gary been institutionalized? Homeless? Traveling under a different name? Had he been part of a state-run facility whose records were later destroyed or lost? Investigators found themselves submerged in layers of possibilities, each one more uncertain than the last. What they did know, what they could prove, was that in the years leading up to his disappearance, Gary had been living in the Everett area. Social Security data placed him there, and that placed him close to Sheldon's residence. Close enough for regular contact, close enough for help, close enough for someone to notice if he vanished. Yet no one did, and no one ever reported him missing. Investigators grew increasingly troubled by this. The idea that a man could disappear within miles of his family home and be gone for years without a single inquiry felt deeply unsettling. Detective Scharf put it bluntly. People don't just vanish without someone noticing. Someone always knows something. Someone always remembers. But Gary's case defied that principle. The next clue, built upon the oldest one, the shattered femur. When Dr. Kathy Taylor analyzed his bones, she described the fracture as catastrophic, not the type of injury someone could hide, not an injury someone could ignore, and certainly not something someone could live with in silence for years without help. The break had never been treated professionally, not by any medical facility, not by any emergency room, not by any physician. The bone had been left to heal on its own, twisting, shrinking, and creating a deformity that would have been visible from a distance. Dr. Taylor estimated Gary would have walked with a pronounced limp. His gait would have been uneven, uncomfortable, and unmistakably painful. The healed femur had shortened his left leg by roughly 2 inches. Anyone who saw him walk would have remembered. And yet, none of Gary's relatives remembered such an injury. No documents confirmed it. No medical records referenced it. Which left detectives with another disturbing question. Where did Gary sustain such a devastating injury? And why had he never received medical help? The theories grew darker. Some believed he might have been injured in an environment where medical care was inaccessible, a remote job, a ship, a migrant work setting, or a transient lifestyle. Others believed he may have been harmed intentionally or accidentally by another person. Perhaps the injury came from a confrontation, a fall, or an assault. Without witnesses, the possibilities were endless. Another theory, one that investigators hesitated to voice, was that the injury might have occurred during a mental health crisis, a fall from height, a jump, a collapse, something tragic and unintentional. Whatever the cause, one thing was certain: Gary lived with the pain for years. And it shaped his life. Investigators wondered if the injury contributed to his disappearance. Severe pain, untreated trauma, and mental illness can create vulnerability. Vulnerability that can lead people into dangerous environments or into the grasp of dangerous people. Even the dental evidence added layers of contradiction rather than clarity. His alloy fillings proved he had received proper dental care earlier in life. Yet his missing teeth, 2 upper front teeth and 2 molars, suggested trauma or decay left unaddressed for years. Why did Gary receive dental care but never receive treatment for a shattered femur? Was he forced into adulthood too soon, left to fend for himself? Did he lose insurance coverage after leaving his family home? Did he slip through the cracks of a medical system not designed to help people with untreated mental illness in the 1970s? Or was someone withholding medical care from him? Investigators couldn't answer these questions. They could only piece together the fragments of a life that had ended in isolation. The remains discovered in 1979 offered no clues about the manner of death, no signs of violence, no signs of drowning, no signs of trauma at the time of death. Only old injuries, each healed in ways that suggested a long history of pain. Detectives developed theories about how Gary ended up on the tide flats. Perhaps he had been living near the river. Perhaps he had been sleeping rough. Perhaps he had fallen into the water accidentally. Perhaps the tide pulled him downstream. Perhaps he died elsewhere and the current relocated him. Perhaps erosion separated his remains over time. It was also possible he had been living or working on a fishing vessel or barge and had fallen overboard accidentally or otherwise. The tide patterns near North Spencer Island could easily move remains from one location to another over several days or weeks. The more the detectives explored, the more the questions multiplied. And then there was Sheldon, Gary's adoptive father. The more investigators learned about Gary's adult life, the more glaring Sheldon's silence became. Why did he never speak of Gary? Why did he never report him missing? Why did he never mention him to extended family in Texas? Why did he never bring him up during visits in the 1980s? Why did he live in the same region as Gary and say nothing to anyone? Some relatives wondered whether Gary and Sheldon had experienced a severe falling out that pushed Gary out of the home permanently. Others wondered whether Gary had been placed in a facility, boarding home, or supervised living environment, and that paperwork had simply vanished over time. But darker theories also surfaced. Had Sheldon abandoned Gary? Had he cut him off financially, emotionally, or physically? Had he reached a breaking point after decades of struggling to understand his adoptive son's mental health, or was something else at play? Investigators did not accuse Sheldon of wrongdoing. He had died in 1997, decades before the identification. He could never answer questions. He could never defend himself. So detectives treated the possibility with sensitivity. But the truth remained. Sheldon never filed a missing person report for his son. And investigators could not ignore that fact. The next unsettling revelation came when detectives examined Sheldon's lifestyle. After retiring, Sheldon became what relatives called a snowbird. He left Washington every winter, spending months in Baja California, Mexico, enjoying the warmth. Meanwhile, no one in the family had any knowledge of Gary's whereabouts. During a mid-1980s visit to Texas, Sheldon spoke about many things. But not once did he mention his adoptive son. Not once. Relatives only learned of Gary's fate in 2023, through law enforcement, not through family memory. This was not a man whose disappearance had been mourned. This was not a man whose loss had been noticed. This was a man whose absence had gone unacknowledged for nearly half a century. And that was perhaps the most tragic part of all. Detectives revisited the few personal details they had recovered from the scene: the wallet, the shoes, the belt, the shirt, hoping to understand who Gary was in his final days. They noted that the clothing could have been secondhand, or donated, or purchased cheaply. They noted the wallet held no identification. But they could not determine whether those items had been stolen, lost to water, or simply discarded by time. Everything about Gary's final circumstances remained locked away in silence. As the months passed after the identification, investigators hoped that renewed attention might lead someone to come forward with a memory. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a coworker, maybe someone who saw a man with a limp walking through Everett in the late 1970s. Maybe someone who rented rooms to quiet boarders. Maybe someone who remembered the homeless community along the river. Maybe someone who worked in local canneries or fisheries. Someone. Anyone. But no one came forward. Gary had lived and died unseen. Even in death, the tide scattered his remains, separating his life into pieces that no one could fully reassemble. His case became a haunting example of how a person can slip entirely out of the world without anyone noticing, how a life can become invisible, how someone can suffer, wander, and disappear without documentation, without advocacy, without a single person raising an alarm. And yet, despite all that darkness, Gary's name did return. Investigators, genealogists, scientists, and strangers who had never met him refused to let him remain unknown. In the end, it was modern science, not family, not memories, not photographs that returned Gary to the world. For the first time in 44 years, the nameless man buried beneath the earth finally had his identity restored. But the truth about his final days still hovered just out of reach. Detectives knew that Spencer Island could not tell the story of his last moments. The tide, the mud, and the erosion had dismantled everything. There was no way to know if Gary had died of hypothermia, drowning, medical collapse, or simple exposure. His bones showed no signs of perimortem trauma. He had not been stabbed, shot, bludgeoned, or strangled. There were no signs of a violent end, but there were signs of suffering, and signs of abandonment, and signs that whatever happened to him, he endured it alone. As relatives processed the news of his identification, they expressed sorrow not only for his death but for the fact that his life had slipped into obscurity. Step-cousin Hal said, "I felt a draw to do something about his gravesite." But he also said something more heartbreaking. There was never a conversation about Gary. It just never came up. Even in the family memory, Gary had become a blank space. In the wake of the identification, investigators hoped for more clarity. But they accepted a difficult truth. There may never be answers to the most important questions. What happened to Gary after 1976? Where did he go? Who saw him last? What caused him to end up near Spencer Island? Did he die alone and unobserved? Or did someone know and simply never tell? Uncertainty became the final chapter of Gary's story, one that stretched across 44 years of unanswered questions. But his identity was no longer lost. And his story, once buried, once forgotten, had now been pulled back into the light. Even after the identification in February of 2023, investigators knew something sobering. This was likely as close to the truth as anyone would ever get. Cold cases rarely give up every answer. Some keep pieces locked away forever. But with Gary Lee Haney, the locked pieces weren't the details of the crime, they were the details of the life he lived. And sometimes, that is the deeper tragedy. In the months following the announcement, Snohomish County officials revisited every document, every photograph, every sliver of evidence that had once defined John Doe 1979-1. They reviewed the photographs taken the day his remains were first discovered, the mud-soaked clothing, the scattered bones, the cedar log near which the skull had been found. They reviewed the digital model of his skull, the rebuilt facial structure, the files from Othram Labs, the genealogical charts created by the medical examiner's office. For decades, those items had belonged to a man without a name. Now they belonged to someone. And that changed everything. His identity didn't rewrite the evidence, but it reframed it. Every detail suddenly belonged to a real human being with a history, a childhood, a family tree, fears, dreams, and flaws. Every scar on the bone had meaning. Every healed fracture represented a day he lived. Every missing tooth represented a moment that changed him physically. Every gap in the record represented a silence he had lived inside. He had once been a boy. He had once been someone's son. He had once been someone's student, someone's friend, someone's neighbor. He had once sat in classrooms, lived in family homes, carried belongings, felt joy, felt fear, felt confusion. And then the world slowly lost him. The investigation shifted from the question of identity to the question of cause. Though detectives understood the odds of learning how he died were slim, the remains from 1979 had been scattered, stripped, and aged in ways that erased most forensic markers of death. There were no signs of peri-mortem trauma, no fractures consistent with an assault, no cuts, no tool marks, no bullet wounds. The skull bore no fractures from violence. The ribs held no breaks that corresponded with the time of death. Nothing suggested murder, but nothing ruled out the possibility. Water, cold, time, and erosion could hide anything. Investigators tried to reconstruct the area as it looked in the late 1970s. North Spencer Island was then what it is now, low, marshy, shaped by tide, wind, and unpredictable channels of water. A fall into the sloughs could easily disorient a person. Strong currents could carry a body downstream. Hypothermia could set in silently, without struggle. Even an experienced fisherman or longtime local could be overwhelmed. And then there was the possibility that Gary never entered the water alive. Detectives considered that he might have died near the shoreline, collapsed from exhaustion, medical distress, malnutrition, or exposure. If he had been struggling physically or mentally, he might have wandered into a remote area where no one would see him. The cold could have overtaken him silently. His body might have been gradually pulled apart by animals, tides, and weather. Nature doesn't leave a body untouched, especially not for months. The truth that lingered was painful. Gary's death might not have been dramatic. It might not have involved another person. It might have been quiet, lonely, and unnoticed, a slow fade into the environment around him. And for many people living with untreated mental illness or in unstable housing in the 1970s, that was tragically common. But what continued to haunt the investigators was the awkward truth that no one searched for him. No report was filed, no inquiry was made, no relative called police, no letter or phone call was traced. Nothing. He was not missing in the eyes of anyone who knew him. Because no one noticed, he was gone. For detectives, that fact felt heavier than any forensic discovery. They wanted to understand Gary's relationship with his adoptive father, Sheldon, more clearly. But the man had died 26 years before the identification. There were no diaries, no interviews, no personal letters, no surviving documents that detailed what their relationship truly was. Relatives gave conflicting impressions. Some said Sheldon had been strict but not cruel. Others said he kept his emotions locked away. Still others said he did what he could, but lacked the tools to support someone who may have struggled with mental illness. Investigators reminded themselves repeatedly not to assign guilt where no evidence existed. Sheldon could no longer answer questions. He could no longer clarify choices or correct assumptions. And so detectives approached every possibility with caution, refusing to paint him as a villain or a cause of harm without reason. Still, the silence around Gary felt unnatural, as though entire chapters of his life had been removed, leaving only faint outlines. The genealogical work revealed more about his lineage than about his adulthood. They discovered relatives in multiple states, some in Arizona, some in New Mexico, some in Colorado, some in Texas. Many were distant. Some had never even heard of Gary. His step-cousin Hal had met him only twice in his life. The distance of time and geography had dissolved whatever bonds once existed. Hal described Gary as the lost one, not with judgment, but with sadness. He said he wished he had known him better. He wished he had understood what had happened to him. He wished the family had stayed closer. He wished someone had looked for him. That sense of regret ran deep, a longing to rewrite a past that could no longer be touched. Investigators also hoped Gary's identification might reveal clues about his shattered femur when it occurred, where it occurred, and whether anyone had known about it. But his extended family had no answers. They said Gary looked normal as a child. They had no memory of him limping, no memory of an accident, no memory of any injury severe enough to shatter a femur. And that created a new timeline, one that suggested Gary's devastating injury likely happened in adulthood, after he was no longer in close contact with relatives. That realization added new layers of possibility. Had he been working manual labor? Had he been living in a dangerous environment? Had he been injured in a place where he received no help or was unable to access help? Had he been too afraid to seek medical treatment? Had he been isolated by his mental illness to the point where he avoided hospitals altogether? Or had someone else caused the injury? The question reverberated through the investigation, though detectives acknowledged they may never find the answer. The reconstruction of Gary's life continued in slow, careful steps. Investigators combed through boarding house records, employment logs, welfare documents, and hospital archives. Many had been destroyed or lost. The 1970s were a period of poor record preservation. Even city directories were incomplete. Phone books listed names, but not histories. And Gary, living under the weight of mental illness and instability, might not have held a job long enough to appear in any records. There was one clue, a rumor that he had stayed in a rooming house around 1976, but the building was long gone. No records remained, no landlords were alive, no neighbors could be contacted. The boarding house had vanished, just like the man who had once lived there. It became clear that Gary had slipped through the system at every stage: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and death. He had been born into a life that moved too fast. He had lost both biological parents before reaching 20. He had wandered through adulthood without stable support. He had lived with untreated mental illness. He had suffered a catastrophic injury without medical intervention. And he had died without anyone noticing. Detectives, medical examiners, genealogists, and forensic anthropologists had all come together to give Gary back his name. But the truth of his final days refused to surface. There were no witnesses, no written accounts, no physical evidence left behind. The tide had taken everything. Even the wallet found with his remains was long emptied by the water. Investigators could not tell whether it had once held identification. The fabric had been worn by river sediment, the corners softened, the stitching frayed to nothing. If Gary had carried any clue about his identity, nature had erased it long before police arrived. The shirt red, orange, white, and gray, checkered, also revealed nothing. It had likely been inexpensive, possibly second-hand. The pants carried a simple label, "Never needs ironing, P-Soles. Made in the United States." That marked the clothing as common for the era, affordable for anyone. The size of the shoes told investigators something about Gary's stature, but little else. Even the SOG gear found near his remains, examined closely for serial numbers, led nowhere. It might have been his. It might have belonged to someone else. It might have drifted from a boat or shoreline long before Gary died. Nature had a way of mingling stories in places like the Snohomish River Delta. What investigators could say, what they felt confident about, was that Gary likely suffered in silence. His untreated injuries, his missing teeth, his lack of contact with family, the absence of medical records, the void of community awareness, all pointed to someone who had been disconnected from the world. And that disconnection is what allowed his death to go unnoticed. For 44 years, in the end, the case became less about solving a crime and more about something deeper: the importance of identity, the consequences of isolation, and the modern miracle of forensic genealogy. Without genealogical DNA, Gary would still be John Doe 1979-1. His bones would remain unidentified beneath the soil of Cypress Memorial Park. No one would know his name. No one would know his story. No one would know the journey, painful, fractured, tragic, that had brought him from Kansas to Washington. Science gave him back what life had taken: recognition. When investigators informed Gary's surviving relatives, the family expressed a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that they had never known what happened. Sadness that no one had looked for him. Sadness that he had died alone. But relief that after 4 decades, he had been found. His step-cousin Hal said he hoped to place a marker on Gary's grave, something simple, something respectful. He said, "We have no relatives who live up there, but someone should mark it." A life without acknowledgement deserved at least a name. The medical examiner's office agreed. They documented his identity, updated the records, and preserved the genealogical data that had helped solve the case. It became one of the county's most profound reminders of why cold cases matter not only for justice, but for human dignity. In the world of true crime, many stories revolve around violence, danger, and murder. But Gary's case was different. His story revealed the quiet side of tragedy, the kind that hides in plain sight, the kind shaped by mental illness, family distance, and a society unprepared to care for those who slip through its cracks. Gary didn't vanish because someone abducted him. He didn't disappear because someone covered up a crime. He vanished because no one saw him leave. He vanished because he lived on the margins of a world that looked away. Even after his identification, investigators remained haunted by one question that lingered heavier than all the others. Who was with Gary in his last moments? Was he alone? Was he scared? Was he disoriented? Was he exhausted? Did he call out for help that never came? Or was his passing quiet, a slow slipping away into the cold marshland around him? No one could say, and no one ever would. But his story, once forgotten, now had a voice. And that voice belonged to truth, not speculation. As we look back at the journey that brought Gary home, it's clear that his case isn't only about death, it's about remembrance. About the value of each human life, even those lived in shadows. About how science, compassion, and persistence can restore dignity to someone the world overlooked. From a muddy shoreline in 1979 to a laboratory in 2023, Gary's story traveled nearly half a century to reach its ending. And now his name will never be lost again. This is Disturbed Intent. If you value bringing forgotten stories back into the light, take a moment to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. It helps make sure no one's story is ever left behind again. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay safe.